right, welcome to the SSAA Victoria Podcast. As we've said at the start of all of these podcasts, these are occasional podcasts where we try to take a deep dive on some of the issues in shooting and hunting in Victoria. Joining me once again to my left is David Laird, the Hunting Development Manager with SSAA Victoria.
Hello, thanks for joining us again.
And to my right is our Training and Programs Manager, Daryl Snowden.
Hey Barry, good to be here.
So make sure you subscribe and like and do all the good stuff on your favourite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Today we're going to take a bit of a deep dive on public land access. It's something that's relevant across the shooting and hunting area, and it's something that's always been a very contested area of policy and something that's always been really important to our interests as shooters and as hunters. Something that SSAA Victoria has been actively working on and actively involved in the contest on in the entire time the association's been in existence. So for the last since World War II, these issues have been quite contested in the public square, as they are today, and as they will be going well into the future. So we thought it was timely to take a bit of a deep dive and look at the big picture with public land and where we're going with it, just so that members can have a bit of a better understanding why we're taking the policy positions we're taking as these issues keep progressing. So the last one of these podcasts we did was about 3 months ago when we looked at the Wildlife Game Regulation Review. That's all completed now, with the big news out of it being, I suppose, that the government's not going to proceed with the transition away from lead ammunition for deer hunting at this time. The other, when you step back and look at that review away from the cut and thrust of it, I suppose the big story out of it is that there was not much change at all, that we maintain the status quo. So depending on what camp you're in, and maybe you can be in both camps, that's either a good thing or a real opportunity missed.
Oh, I think it's a good thing.
I think we've come off good regs, so keeping good regs is a good thing, but you do look at a once-in-a-decade review and think there were opportunities to push things forward there that didn't happen.
I think we talked about it last time. It's going to happen. It's just a matter of when it's going to happen, and we need to have a transition to that point. Just picking a date in time and saying, today we're going to make this huge change that's like a fundamental change to hunting is not feasible. So, we know it's coming, but we've just dodged a bullet for a little while, but the bullet's still coming, so to speak.
Absolutely, and I mean, our suggestion of forming a working group hasn't been formally accepted, but that could well be on the cards, and that's the way to go forward with this. An objective look at it, look at all the issues, not just the lead side of it. Look at the wounding, the efficacy of copper bullets and non-lead bullets, and make sure that where we're going is sort of where we want to end up, and we don't have unintended consequences of some of these changes that sort of could have been rushed through. So yeah, good outcome that.
And there's other things that were put forward by groups through that process that didn't get a run that we're going to keep pursuing, because we shouldn't have to wait a decade for good ideas to get up. So Victorian Hound Hunters put forward some sensible proposals for some new hound breeds. The government's indicated that they'll be making some changes on hog deer and on duck hunting and all sorts of stuff in the next year or two. We were in last week with government saying, well, when you're getting ready to do that, make sure that you start the consultation now on these new hound breeds and on these other things. Don't wait a decade for some of these ideas to come back through.
Yeah, and that's, as an organisation, we certainly support other organisations if they put up a good case. Whilst we don't have a big sort of input into hound hunting, it's an interest, and some of our members obviously do it, but it's not our key sort of area. But yeah, other groups put up good ideas. We're more than happy to support those.
And while we're here, before we deep dive into public land, I think it's timely to probably have a bit of a look back on what SSAA Victoria has been up to this year, 2024. We haven't got any tinsel around, but we're certainly very much in the Christmas season.
Barry's already wound down.
How many days till our Christmas party, Baz?
Somebody might have accidentally mentioned in earshot of the boss that after this event we're winding down for the year, and
now we all have more work to do.
Now we all have more work to do. We won't make that mistake again. I'll start off with some sad news, which was the news we got last Friday that Dennis Moroney had passed away. Dennis was on the board of SSAA Victoria for 12 years and served for 8 years as its president, and served under Dennis's term as president a massive transformation in SSAA Victoria.
Yeah, I've worked with Dennis for the last 8 years, and always found him really, really good to work with. He was always supportive of state office, and I think provided some really good leadership for the association during his time in charge, and the contribution he made when he was on the board.
Yeah, and our CEO Jack mentioned to me after we put a post on Facebook that there were so many positive comments on Facebook, and I made the comment that, and it's something that's certainly rare for people who work in the sort of space we work in that's quite contested and full of passionate people. I don't think Dennis had an enemy. I don't think there was anyone who saw him as anything other than a gentleman and somebody who you could easily talk to and work with, which great testament to the man, I think.
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
Absolutely.
100%.
Lots of other stuff happening, of course, this year. In January, we, SSAA Victoria and other groups were front and centre when the government committed to a future for duck and quail hunting, and that's still shaping up. So we're still looking at how that rolls out, particularly with things like the adaptive harvest model, which has been long mooted, and I think GMA are running a webinar on that
Thursday.
This Thursday.
this Thursday. So by the time this goes to air, they'll have run that webinar and people will have their own view on what sort of information they got in that. And tied to that is a thing called a harvest strategy. Who wants to have a go at explaining harvest strategy?
We're still waiting to get a brief on what it actually contains. So it's just a strategy. So set targets and goals. So what the goal is of the harvest. So it'll set upper and lower limits, etc., based on population densities, essentially.
So what we're probably looking as hunters for a maximum sustainable take as a strategy, so that we can maximise the take of the resource. I know within some of the bureaucratic areas and some of the anti-hunting areas in particular, they don't want to see that. They want to see a much lower sort of harvest set. So that's still the political element of this that we need to sort of sort out over the coming weeks and months.
Yeah, so it's whilst we've got this commitment to move forward with duck hunting and all very positive for the future, those nuts and bolts things are going to be really critical to how that shapes up as hunter opportunity going forward for the next few years. And we're still very much waiting on that process. I think the Game Management Authority have a meeting on the 19th of December, and whether out of that comes the sort of information on what the season conditions will be for 2025, or whether we have to wait till late January again, which I hope not.
Yeah, look, we certainly don't want to go there again. Realistically, we may, but that's where we're pushing for as an organisation, to get away from that. So basically the model will eventually, hopefully, spit out a number, and that'll be it. There won't need to be all this toing and froing and discussion. It'll be basically hunters should know in the lead up to Christmas or very early in the new year what the bag limit is, and everyone can make some planning according to that.
Another thing we did in May this year, SSAA Victoria hosted the first ever what we called the Responsible Shooting Expo in Queen's Hall in the Parliament. I think we touched on it in the last podcast, but so what we did was bring shooting groups into Queen's Hall, which is the main artery of the Parliament, for a full week during a parliamentary sitting week to host an expo. So to stand there and catch the MPs as they're walking through to and from the chamber and talk to them about what we do as shooters and hunters and how we can be involved in these conversations about responsible shooting and hunting as a part of the community. The culmination of that was a lunch that we hosted in Queen's Hall where the Minister for the Environment and his shadow both gave really eloquent, supportive speeches. The Minister for the Environment basically opened his speech by reassuring us that shooters are very welcome in the Victorian Parliament and that we have a role to play as stakeholders just like any other member of the community.
Yeah, I think that bipartisan support was really encouraging, and it just can't be overstated the importance of these sort of events. Well done, Baz, for organising this one. A lot of work going on in the background onto that to make this happen. But it's just a really good opportunity to talk to politicians and their staffers about a whole range of issues, because often they have sort of misconceptions about specific things, and just those conversations where you can talk to them and they ask something and you can address that and make sure they've got the right information, I think goes a long way to promoting what we do and making sure that they actually understand what we're doing and the realities of it.
Then in October, the association ran the Shot Expo at the Melbourne Showgrounds. So it was the first major shooting, hunting, outdoors expo in Victoria since 2019. 14,500 people through the doors. What can we say? It was a massive success.
It was massive.
It was
massive's the word.
I think that was the one criticism that some people who turned up on the Saturday morning said there was too many people there. So if that's a criticism, I think we'll wear that.
Exhibitors thought it was fantastic.
They were very happy.
Some of the patrons thought it was a bit busy, but
it was.
We'll work on that in the future.
On that Saturday morning, it was absolutely heaving. That
it was
building
great.
was
Biggest problem we faced was the capacity limits of the venue, which is a good problem for us, but
it's one of those quality problems, isn't it? We've got too many people have shown up and wanted to pay their money to get in the door. How bad was that?
Yeah, so next time we'll have to make it bigger.
And then in November, so quite recently, we hosted the second annual Hunters for the Hungry barbecue on the rooftop terrace in Parliament House. And that, again, was, I think it was a bigger success than last year.
I think so.
We had 100-odd MPs and their staffers show up, including the Premier, who stayed for quite a long time for her game meat lunch, and a number of senior ministers and shadow ministers. And again, it was great to have all of those people come together and show that they can have reasonable conversations with the shooting community, and that they appreciate that what we can do can be sustainable and a part of mainstream society, I suppose.
Yeah, I just think the fact that you can get the Premier and the Minister to sit down at a lunch hosted by SSAA is a success in itself. The fact that they hung around and were willing to have photographs taken, etc., I think it's a huge success.
Yeah.
And the Minister making an impromptu sort of welcoming speech, I think that was really telling. There was no requirement for him to do that, but he did that off his own bat, and that was really good to see.
It was all really positive, and afterwards we had a lot of our staff from State Office in, and the CEO and a few of the staff were walking around with Jeff Borman, took everyone on the $2 tour.
I want my money back.
And a senior government MP from the upper house sort of ran into Jack in the hall and commented on how happy he was that the event was so bipartisan, that there was actually a rarity where they're sitting down eating their lunch with people from the other side, and that was he was really taken by what a great bipartisan event it is. So really pleased to hear that.
I mean, well, that's what we're all about at SSAA. We're not a political organisation. We work in a political environment. So we engage with all sides of politics and deal with the issues. So really good to see.
On top of all that, we've been busy working on lots and lots of things, of course, but on the political front, we've had firearm regulation that we work through with this Victorian Firearm Consultative Committee. There's been a number of government inquiries we've made submissions to and presented to this year. Stuff like the State Game Reserve regulations that we're still into right now, a bit of to and fro. There's an inquiry into the Commonwealth Games, and we've had probably literally hundreds of meetings with MPs and advisors and public servants. And this is what we're doing every year, representing what are now 45,000 members and 250,000 shooters and hunters in Victoria. All right, so that's all of the intros out of the way, a bit of a long intro, but fair bit to cover. Public land. The first question, I suppose, when we're putting this together is what is Crown land and who owns it? And it's a pretty simple definition, is that it's land that the state or Commonwealth government owns on behalf of the public. So Commonwealth land tends to be things like defence facilities and airports. Most Crown land in Victoria is managed by the Victorian state government. So it's not owned by King Charles in England, who controls everything on it. That's the origin of the etymology of the term, I suppose. But it's technically owned by the state of Victoria, managed by the Victorian state government for the public of Victoria. There's also some public land like local parks and sporting grounds that sits with local councils. And then there's other land that's owned by other instrumentalities. But if we look at Crown land in Victoria, there's about 8 million hectares of it. And that's over 110,000 separate parcels of Crown land. And half of that is in state or national parks. So about 4 million hectares is tied up in state and national park. About 40%, 39% is in state forests, and that's 3.2 million hectares. 4% of it is that stuff that's managed by the Commonwealth Government, so things like defence facilities and airports. 7% in what are called Crown land reserves. About 500,000 hectares is in Crown land reserves, and that's government-owned land that has things like public schools, TAFEs, universities, hospitals, cemeteries, roads, railways, local halls. So if you look at some of the land that we use for shooting facilities, there'd be local pistol clubs sitting on some of that Crown land reserve sort of land. And there's also Crown water frontages in that, which is public land that runs alongside rivers, of which there's a fair bit in this state. And the big thing that's coming into public land management that's increasingly of interest to us is joint management. So in 2010, an act with an unfortunate acronym, the Traditional Owner Settlement Act, established a framework for joint management of some Crown land between state government agencies and traditional owners. Victoria currently has joint management arrangements with 4 traditional owner groups. And I'll go through them quickly, but more as they apply to hunting and shooting rather than all of the land that's covered under them. So there's the Gunai-Kurnai, which is the mob in Gippsland, taking in most of Gippsland from about Warragul-Druin through to the border. And the land under joint management that interests us includes the Gippsland Lakes Coastal Park, the Mitchell River National Park, Baw National Park, the Nurramugga Coastal Reserve, which is very soon to have a management plan in place for the first time ever as part of this joint management, the Avon Wilderness and the southern parts of the Alpine National Park. And then in central Victoria, which you think of some of that duck hunting country in Tang Tang and places like that, is the Dja Dja Wurrung. Lots of pretty important duck hunting country involved in that. You go out through places like Boort and all out through there, and that's under Dja Dja Wurrung joint management. So there's interesting stuff happening and developing through joint management there. Probably the most notable at this early stage, and it's probably a bit of a pilot, is on Tang Tang Reserve out of Bendigo. We're actually up there for the launch of the traditional owner game management strategy, and that's an example of joint management and of traditional owners managing something that's a very specific hunting place for benefit, hopefully, of all of the community. Then you've got the Tungarung, who are in the northeast of the state. So, think of places like Mansfield, and their areas that they've got under joint management that are really important to us include the northern areas of the Alpine National Park and areas around Lake Eildon and the Eildon National Park. So they're pretty big hunting areas, deer hunting areas. And the other of the 4 groups that have currently got joint management with the Victorian government are the Yorta Yorta, who are the people up around the Murray. And when you think of that from a hunting perspective or from a rec user and a fishing perspective, Barma's the big ticket item when you think of how joint management's going to impact on our issues. So these jointly managed areas continue to be managed under the relevant Public Land Act. So if they have been managed under the National Parks Act, that continues to be the framework they're managed under. If they've been managed under the Forest Act, etc., under which they're reserved. So, but there has been a transfer of title. It doesn't affect the existing use and access, but having said that, there are peripheral issues there. One of them's coming to the fore very much in the public at the moment, which is an issue with rock climbers at the moment at Mount Arapiles. And I think it's very important first to state that that's not an issue with joint management of that reserve. That's not a reserve that's under joint management. But it is an issue that, like I said, is coming more and more to the fore. And it's to do with the application of cultural heritage legislation and other issues to do with this big reconciliation agenda with traditional owners that's going to increasingly play into how public land is managed in this state.
Yeah, and I think that's the issue with the rock climbing at the moment. I think plays into the fears of a lot of our members and outdoor rec users more generally, that they're worried that sort of this joint management is going to impact on what they've been able to do. So obviously it's having an impact here, but that doesn't mean it's going to extend to everywhere. And I think there's going to be isolated instances like that. But overall, the sort of relationships we've been building with some of these groups and discussing some of the issues, there's a lot of sort of common ground there. And a lot of common objectives that I think we can really work together and achieve some really good outcomes. So, certainly some cause for concern in some areas, but this isn't something we need to panic about.
Yeah, it's certainly not that this regime is going to lock up public land everywhere. And but you look at that issue at Duride at Mount Arapiles, and there certainly seems to have been, and look, there's a government inquiry that I suppose now into Parks Victoria that's partly going to go to the failures, but there certainly seems to have been a failure in consultation with the community. I'm very wary that it's very easy when you don't get your own way that you blame consultation, but there certainly seems to have been a failure with consultation with the community and with transparency. You've got rock climbing groups saying it's been closed on the basis of archaeological reports that we're not allowed to see, that the public are not allowed to see. And whether that's happening because that's what the legislation says has to happen, whether that's happening because the local land managers who are running that process are pretty well wedged. There'd be a risk aversion there, but there's a real sensitivity that they will overstep the mark and do the wrong thing with traditional owners. And you do wonder to what extent that plays into them overcorrecting on these issues and tending to be overly cautious on traditional owner issues so as not to run themselves into trouble.
It is fairly common on these cultural heritage sites, so that they aren't made public. So reports are done, the sites are listed on a database. And that's not accessible by the public, so that's fairly standard procedure. But from the outside looking at it, does look like someone's got something to hide. But it's more about protecting those cultural heritage sites. So it is common that those sites aren't made public.
And there are good, like as you're sort of referring, that there can be good reasons for that.
Yeah, sure.
And part of that could be that there are people in our community who, if they were aware of those cultural heritage sites and where they are, would go and vandalise them.
Yeah, there's no if, buts or maybes. So people take issues in their own hands, and if there's not a site there anymore, there's no issue. So, yeah, it's more than possible that could happen.
So, like everything, this is a really complex issue. And when I talk about we've had this 70-year conversation and contest over the use of public land, this is going to be an increasing feature of that. Hopefully it can continue to be a largely respectful and collaborative feature of that broader conversation about public land, but it's something that's increasingly going to play a role in how public land is managed in Victoria.
Yeah, but like all historical, cultural heritage sites around the globe, the answer to protecting them is not hiding them away and locking them up.
It's not. And the other thing which we can touch on, which a few of us have had experience with, is, again, a risk aversion around cultural heritage sites where we've been trying to do some what we would think is perhaps fairly practical stuff on reserves, like spraying introduced weeds or slashing already made tracks, and that's getting stopped through lack of a cultural heritage permit. And it's very
We've seen a bit of that.
It's very easy for people to then blame the traditional owners for that, and I'm not convinced that it's the traditional owners in most of those instances who are the impediment.
Yeah, and that's certainly what we've found in a couple of instances at least, that this excuse has been given as to why things aren't being done. And, the TO card is played, but when you actually talk to the TOs involved, they haven't been playing that card. So we've just got to be mindful of that as well.
But that's not to say that that's not happening in places either.
Absolutely.
But it certainly shouldn't just be assumed that it's traditional owners trying to stop people from doing things on the land, because our experience is that's not always the case.
Yeah. And that's why we're engaging with TOs in these areas, particularly the areas that sort of have an impact on hunting, to talk with them directly and work out what those areas of common ground are and how we can work together and remove some of these impediments and some of this misunderstanding.
Yeah. And another thing, I suppose, for people at home to bear in mind is a part of that will be that we don't reach agreement, we don't reach common ground, and we might lose out on some areas as a consequence of that. That may be a part of this going forward.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, we always aim to get what we want in every situation, but we don't always achieve that, and we've got to be aware of that as well.
Okay, so I think it's an important thing to have touched on. Stepping back a bit, I suppose, it's probably simplest when we're looking at public land for shooting and hunting in Victoria to look at it in two broad buckets. There's a heap of different legislation that covers it and a heap of land classifications, but the two big buckets come down to who is managing it. So there's land managed by Parks Victoria, which is about half of the public land in the state. And then there's land managed by the Department of Energy, Environment and Climate Action, which is roughly the other half. Parks Victoria, from our shooting hunting perspective, we're talking national and state parks and state game reserves are the two really important pieces of public land that fall in under that. National and state parks, generally the most restrictive, but we do have deer stalking in some of them.
Yeah, and that goes back to sort of the establishment of the Alpine National Park back in the late 70s, early 80s, I think that was. And that was the Wanagata in particular was sort of the mecca of deer hunting in Victoria at that stage. And when they made it into a national park, that was sort of the deal that was made that deer hunting would be able to continue there. And over recent years, we've actually got access to different areas of national park for deer hunting. Until relatively recently too, it was just Samba. Now that's been changed as well, so we've got access for all deer hunting in those areas that are open for hunting in national parks. So,
important to note that SSAA Victoria and others have been pushing for extended access for deer stalking in particular in more parts of the Lake Eildon Park, the Mitchell River Park, and in places like Mount Buffalo, the Snowy, Errinundra, Cooper, Canberra. So whilst we've gained a fair bit of park access over the years, there's been a 542% increase in the number of deer hunters over the past 30 years. And really commensurate to that, only marginal increases in the public land available. And as Dave said, in the 70s, 80s, we were able to continue access to these parks because we had a history of deer hunting in them. Well, we didn't have a history of deer hunting in the Snowy or the Errinundra.
there was no deer there.
Because there's no deer there.
The world's changed.
Ken Slee took a photo in the Snowy River. Ken will tell you it's a very famous photo of a big Samba stag running up the Snowy River, and that was about a week before it became a national park, I think, and it was the first deer he'd ever seen in there. But you fast forward sort of 30 or 40 years, you now have these parks that are a long way from Melbourne, really low visitation, really good deer numbers, and we don't have access to them, whereas we have parks that are far closer to Melbourne, far higher visitation and arguably lower deer numbers, and we have access to them just through a quirk of history.
Yeah, and interestingly, though, the Snowy and some of those East Gippsland parks you mentioned are where we've seen the most activity with aerial deer culling as well.
Yeah, so there's deer there.
So there was no deer there.
There's plenty of deer there.
Camping on the upper Snowy for many, many years. And I remember, a bit like Ken, I remember the first time we saw a deer and almost fell over. We'd had pigs and horses and various other things, but I still remember the first deer we saw and it was a bit of a shock. And now, especially since the fires, they're the areas where we've seen the most aerial culling in Victoria.
Yeah, and that's why it just seems like such a no-brainer to us, and it's a big part of the reason why we keep pushing for this access, because we've got government that's spending a fortune trying to control deer numbers in those areas. There are low visitor numbers on other things. Hunting is a very compatible activity in those areas, and there's just really no logical reason why you wouldn't be letting deer hunters in there to go and hunt those deer.
I think we're in furious agreement.
Yeah, it sounds like it.
Also in national and state parks, so away from state game reserves, we do have duck hunting in parts of the Gippsland Lakes Coastal Park, Lake Albacutcha.
It's an interesting one.
Why is it?
It doesn't hold water very often.
There you go.
It's very.
You can duck.
It's a mysterious one.
There's a number of state game reserves that have got that problem. Parts of the Nurramunga, that's some people that we're friendly with. We've had many conversations about which parts of the Nurramunga and exactly what you can do where, but parts of the Nurramunga Coastal Reserve and on the banks of the Murray River, we have duck hunting.
And Cape Conran.
Missed one? There you go. You ever duck hunted at Cape Conran, Daryl?
On the river there, yeah. There's a couple of state game reserves. Yep, I have.
We also have seasonal hog deer hunting, so we're getting to the most important bit of the podcast here, Daryl.
We couldn't possibly have a podcast and not talk about hog deer, Barry.
We can't have a day in our office where we don't talk about hog deer. We have seasonal hog deer hunting in parts of the Nyurumunga, and we've got, on top of that, we've got ballarded hunting in a number of parks, so in Snake Island, of course, and on Blonde Bay and Bull Pool. And so the other one we've got, which is probably unique for national and state parks, is, and it's back to our friend Lake Albocatcha, we have pest animal hunting at Lake Albocatcha. I think we need to maybe do a road trip up and see this magical lake that's got no water.
It was a commercial fishery once upon a time, but I think now pest animal hunting is probably its prime thing there.
The lake with no lake, but it's got
The lake with no lake.
all these things you can do that you can't do in any other park.
But that's the interesting thing about national and state parks. You are allowed to hunt deer in there, so you can hunt game species, but you can't hunt pest species. And that's something that sort of we as an organisation, we recognise a lot of our members aren't deer hunters, they're pest species hunters, and they're basically kept out of those areas. We talk about no-brainers. It just seems to be a no-brainer that you're in those areas and you can hunt deer, and you walk past a wild pig or a goat that's actually having some real negative impacts, and you can't shoot that animal. So it seems a little bit silly. So we certainly push for that. I think the concern that sort of I get from Parks Victoria and government perhaps on that is that deer hunters are licensed. So there is a degree of control over who's going into those areas. There's education material, there's regulations that relate to that, whereas pest species hunting isn't as regulated and there's no licences. So that's not to say that there's not ways around that, but I believe that's sort of one of the concerns that they have and why it hasn't happened. But we'll continue to push for that, and particularly for deer hunters who are there. They see a pest species there, they should be able to shoot it in a national park.
Yeah, I don't think any of us are calling for open slather in national parks as far as hunting goes. But yeah, if you're a licensed to hunt sambar deer, for instance, and you're in the national park and you come across a goat or a pig or similar, it should be able to be dispatched.
Well, that would certainly make some sense, wouldn't it?
And timely that you mention the fact that people are licensed, because the next bit of land that's managed by Parks Victoria that's of interest to hunting is state game reserves, and the history of state game reserves is completely intertwined with the history of game licensing in Victoria. So those licensing regimes for game hunting are the product of what we say is a unique social contract where hunters came together and requested the imposition of regulation and licensing and a fee for the good of the game resource. So it was the late Max Downs, who passed away a month or 6 weeks ago, who was an absolute force of nature. Max, he was the superintendent of game in Victoria at the time, and he'd done some work in looking at what was happening in the United States, and he'd reached an epiphany, I suppose, that the threat to duck species in Victoria was habitat. It wasn't hunting. It wasn't other things. It was the degradation to habitat. It was habitat going off into farmland and the loss of that shallow water, those ephemeral wetlands and that habitat. And Max, for anyone who knew him or had anything to do with him, was not a man to just have these academic thoughts and leave them. He was an absolute man of action. So he coalesced a heap of hunters around him on this idea that, well, if anything's going to change, we need to change it. And our field and game clubs were largely formed around a nexus of that idea that the hunters will get together, the hunters will pay a fee to go and hunt, and that money will then go back into improving, restoring habitat and making things better for the game. And part of that movement was that there's public land that's really suitable duck habitat, and that should be converted into state game reserve. And you look at places like Tower Hill and iconic places like that had piecemeal management but that were public land. And a part of that was that some other land that was not public land at the time was purchased because it was suitable to be really good wildlife habitat and purchased for that reason. So that's the history of state game reserves. We've now got 200 of them in Victoria. All of them are available for duck hunting, which is reflective of, well, all of them are legally available for duck hunting.
there's about half a dozen, I think, that are completely landlocked, and quite a few of them don't hold water these days with drainage and irrigation practices. But technically, they're all available for hunting.
Yeah, well, they're all available for duck hunting. 16 quail, 6 hog deer, 1 sambar deer hunting. So, yeah, look, there's no ifs, buts or maybes. Without the intervention of the government and the licensing, those wetlands wouldn't exist. The majority of them, far and I, would not be there. So it's fundamentally changed our hunting landscape, hunting environment, especially for duck hunting in Victoria. So they're not only there for duck hunting. I know everyone talks about state game reserves are there for the hunters, the duck hunters. They're actually there for the wildlife. They're there for breeding, etc. So a lot of them are ephemeral wetlands, like Barry mentioned earlier. So they don't hold water all the time. Most of them hold water at some time during floods or heavy rain or flash flooding, etc. Most of them will. There are some that have been fairly poorly managed. I can think of one that's got a drain through it that's about as deep as me, and I'm not short. It's a 2-metre hole right through the middle of it. And last time I was there was a farmer there running a pile of sheep through the middle of it and was much horrified when I turned up there in a white unlabelled car and a logoed shirt. And, do you work for the government? No, mate, I don't work for the government. He was a bit nervous. But yeah, there are various states of repair or disrepair. But yeah, all up there's 200 of them.
And we laugh, but it's that neglectful management, I suppose. I'm not blaming any particular agency or people. People work within the budgets they've got, but that neglectful management has become a real feature of our state game reserves. I go see second mention of the podcast, Ken Slee spent about a decade with the ADA revegetating the Clydebank Morass State Game Reserve. It was just degraded form of farmland with some good swamp on it. And now it's a really vibrant forest teeming with biodiversity with some good swamps on it. But his major impediment there was illegal cattle grazing from adjoining farmers coming in and eating and destroying the trees that were getting planted. And there was very little will on behalf of government agencies or ability on behalf of government agencies to curtail that.
Well, there's no money. So a licensing system was set up in the 1950s to finance the purchase of them. And then I think it was the Kane government in the 1980s took that funding away. So there's no funding stream to go into them. So they're managed under Parks Victoria under existing budgets. So there's no income stream anymore as there was when they were purchased originally. So
which the way current budgets are going doesn't bode well for the future. But that was a point that we actually raised in our recent submission on the state game reserves and their regulations that, there's regulations there, but they need to be enforced for this inappropriate activities sort of that are going on. But I think Clydebank shows what can be achieved in these areas. So with a bit of money, a bit of time, a bit of effort, a bit of passion, a lot of them can really come back to their former glory and provide that habitat. And yes, we've sort of got the vested interest because we want to be able to hunt there, but all species benefit from that improved habitat. And it's key to any conservation effort is having that habitat there where all species can exist.
75,000 hectares don't manage themselves though. Need money.
No, they don't. And, I sound like I'm an apologist for the land managers, but when they have a limited budget and they have places of high conservation value that they need to look after, going and kicking some cows out of what to them is essentially just farmland that they have to manage is not going to be a high priority.
But it is our high priority, which is why we advocate and we talk to them about those issues and raise it. But, we do understand their limitations that they have.
The other thing hunters can do in those 200 state game reserves during the duck open season with a game licence.
A few conditions.
Is hunt foxes, rabbits and hares with a shotgun. So
with non-toxic shot.
With non-toxic shot. So
there's a few conditions.
Caveats galore, but you can do it.
We were all involved, I think, when we hatched this plan that we're going to lobby the government to allow the hunting of foxes and rabbits and hares on state game reserves, but never did we think or suggest that it would be by licensed game holders during the duck season between the sunset and sunrise using non-toxic shot. But there you have it.
There you have it. It's better than not having it.
That's right.
I don't know how many foxes, rabbits and hares fall to that allowance, though. I think it's probably a good deal for the foxes, rabbits and hares.
I've actually shot a fox in my decoys on a state game reserve, so there you go.
Well done.
It has happened.
All right. So the other big land manager, so looking after the half of the state that is not in parks and state game reserves or looked after by Parks Victoria, is DECA, so the Department of Energy, Environment and Climate Action.
There you go.
And from here on in, they will just be called DECA. That's predominantly state forest. And state forest is generally the most accessible tenure of public land for hunting. So generally hunting for pest animals and game species is permitted in all state forests, forest parks, of which there are 2, I think, Cobbabombi and Otway, and on an unoccupied Crown land, so Crown land that is not leased or licensed. However, some restrictions may apply, which is probably a good time to give a plug for the More to Explore app.
So I'll give a plug for More to Explore. It's something really good that came out of the Sustainable Hunting Action Plan. Before that, if you wanted to find out sort of where you could hunt, there were some generic maps available on the GMA website. But basically, you'd have to go into your local DECA office or whichever department it was in the lead up to that, and it's had a number of name changes over the years. And the advice you got from there would depend on sometimes the office you went into, it would depend on who you spoke to in that office. So it was very, very unclear. So this feature is really good. It tells you exactly what the land status is, tells you where you can hunt. There's a whole heap of layers on there, so it tells you what species you're allowed to hunt in there. People get a bit concerned because when you first sign into it, there's a little disclaimer saying you still got to obey the law and all those sort of things. It's not nothing to be concerned about. Basically, if you're accessing areas of land according to that map, you'll be fine. Just be aware, though, you've still got to know when your seasons are. So you can't go into a duck area that says you're allowed to hunt ducks out of season. You've still got to obey the game regs and things like that. But it's a really, really good resource and sort of highly recommend it to everyone to have a look at to tell you where you can hunt all the different species in Victoria.
Yeah, the More to Explore app was one, like David said, was one of the best things to come out of the Sustainable Hunting Action Plan. It's available both on your mobile device, so Android, Apple. I feel like I'm giving it a plug. But also there's a desktop version. So whether you're out in the field, you can see where you are exactly. Certainly if you're in state game reserves, the boundaries of state game reserves are notoriously hard to find. Basically, most of them aren't even fenced. So the only way you really know whether you're in or out of a state game reserve is the More to Explore app, because it'll show exactly where you are. But also when you're planning hunting trips, etc., and looking for places to hunt, desktop app's available through MapShare. Still the More to Explore, but it's available through MapShare Victoria. Really good planning application, so you work out where you're going to go and where all the boundaries of your hunting areas are.
Yeah, and don't be daunted by it if you're not super technically literate. As I was saying earlier, my 11-year-old son would comment on what a Luddite his dad, he probably wouldn't use the word Luddite, but he'd comment on what a Luddite his father is. If you can use any app on your phone, you can use More to Explore. It's very simple to use.
Easy, it's awesome. And look, we all use it. It's awesome.
So do that. Don't necessarily follow the government advice on the websites, which is to ring your local office, because you might get quite varying.
Or the hand-drawn state game reserve maps that are...
Well, more likely than not, if someone answers the phone at all, you're likely to get someone who won't necessarily have the subject matter expertise. So in our state forests, you can hunt pest animals at any time throughout the year, although game species are only during their open season and only at the permitted time for that species. So always be aware of that. So make sure you know what the open seasons are. You can't hunt game species at night, for example. So it's just because the app says that you can, or just because the map says that you can, that's not going to go down very well when you get pinged for shooting deer at midnight. Deer hunting by stalking is permitted in the Thompson River Forest Reserve and with the use of hounds or gun dogs in parts of that reserve. So it's a reserve that's a bit separate in status to state forest. But pest animal hunting is not permitted in that reserve. So it's another one of those Lake Albacutches of the world, those funny little ones that sit with a different status and have different rules and everything else.
And look, it is confusing and it's really hard to work out what you can and can't do in some of these reserves. And again, that's where the app comes in handy. It'll tell you exactly what you can and can't do.
And in the Dolitite Arm at Lake Eildon, you're allowed to carry an unloaded shotgun during the duck season. So it's a bit of public land that you're not allowed to shoot on, but you are permitted to carry an unloaded shotgun there.
Eildon's an interesting case. So Eildon, you can hunt ducks on Eildon, but yeah, the land around it has a different land classification than the lake itself. So duck hunting on Lake Eildon, if you're below the high water mark, you're all good. But yeah, it's carrying the firearm through the park to get to the water that can be the issue.
So people who want simple answers to all public land issues, you're not going to find it here.
Yeah,
but,
there's no simple answer.
But that's why More to Explore is a really, really valuable asset, because it will give you that information that you need.
Adding to the complexity of the public land picture is leased and licensed land. And so some public land is leased or licensed to third parties for numerous reasons. We were talking over lunch with our facilities manager in a number of SSAA Victoria's shooting facilities, and I'm sure lots of shotgun ranges and all sorts of stuff sit on land that is either leased or licensed for that purpose. And sometimes that's just dependent on whether the local office issued a lease or a licence. But as broad rules, and these are broad rules, a lease works more or less like a freehold title, and generally a leaseholder can exercise the same rights as a freehold title owner over that as if it's their private property, so they can exclude you from it. A licence, on the other hand, generally permits the licensee to conduct a certain activity on the land but doesn't give them the right to exclude others. So if you're looking at licences for cattle grazing or beekeeping, there's certainly been an issue where licences for cattle grazing have been used to exclude hunting over what was a complete misinterpretation of the law. It was a misinterpretation that persisted for
decades,
but it was a complete misinterpretation of the law that made people believe that they had the right to exclude access to people with firearms. They didn't. So these things, again, your safest bet's to go back to things like More to Explore and see whether you're allowed to or not. But it depends on the terms of them. And there's other private land that's not really private land that there's shooting and hunting and stuff goes on. Great examples, Golden Murray waterland around Lake Eildon.
Eildon's one of them, yep.
There's shooting ranges that certainly SSAA Victoria has a shooting range that's on land that's owned by Alcoa. The new Morwell Gun Club, I believe, is owned by Your Lawn Energy, the land that's on. So there's this land that sort of is not quite public land, not quite private land, big corporation land, or has to be held in an easement, where we end up getting some sort of shooting use out of it. So just to add to the complexity of the whole land picture. All right, so that's a big picture of how the land looks in Victoria.
Simple, isn't it?
Oh, easy.
Why didn't it take 5 minutes to talk?
I know. You're making it complicated.
And for the 70-odd years that there's been contests over public land, there's been various different government agencies, bodies, groups tasked with looking at how public land should be managed. The latest iteration of that is something the government's put together more recently called the Great Outdoors Taskforce. You went to a stakeholder consultation on that pretty recently, Dave?
A couple of weeks ago. Discussed all that. So I suppose the good news from that one was they were very clear that they are not looking to create more national parks. So that was, we addressed the elephant in the room right from the start. Lisa Neville's the chair of that, and she was very clear that there is no intent to make any new national parks from that particular body. So what we're facing at the moment is with the end of logging in Victoria, our state forests have basically been managed for logging for the last 70, 100 years, however long it is. And now with logging finishing, they're looking at ways to use that land and classify that land. So there's some real opportunities that'll come out of that. And there's also some risks because state forests we have had that sort of general access to. We've been able to hunt there from that side of it. People have been able to firewood collect, camp, fossick, do all those sort of things, four-wheel drive, rock climbing, basically all your outdoor pursuits. So as this land is redesignated, that's where, as I say, there's some real opportunities to set things up for the next 50 years, but there's also some threats there that we might lose some of that access that we've had in those areas for a long time. There
could be cases made in some of these areas. I'm not saying there are, but it's worth contemplating that there could be cases made that, hey, there actually is a small area here that has a discrete environmental asset that's really fragile, that can't handle being loved to death, that can't handle a heap of human interaction, and we need to lock this bit away to conserve it. But to have a mindset, and certainly the mindset the government seems to be trying to project through this Great Outdoors Taskforce, is that active use is the rule, and that locking land up would be the exception, whereas we've seen over the last, since the 70s certainly, you look at 50% of that land's now with Parks Victoria. We've seen a national parks movement for whom, and I'll horribly butcher paraphrasing Professor Hugh Possingham here, but for whom creating national parks has become the object. So the object has moved away from protecting biodiversity or protecting really high-value environmental assets to, you see these groups come out and say this government should, as a target, increase the amount of national parks by a percentage. That's just...
Yeah, why?
That's just... What are you trying to achieve with this land? What's the purpose you're trying to achieve? But this whole movement sprung up where most likely started with the purpose was to protect biodiversity. The people who have been pushing for more than a decade for this, what they've dubbed the Great Forest National Park, I know some of them came with a real visceral problem with native timber harvesting.
Yeah.
Whether their ideas were right or wrong, but deeply held conviction that native timber harvesting was a bad thing for our environment. That's where that came from. Native timber harvesting's been banned. Yep. They're still pushing for this Great Forest National Park. What are we trying to protect it from?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, I think it's really telling that when the VIAC did the Central West investigation, and they found that there was still really high conservation values in a whole heap of those areas that had been managed as state forests for sort of well over 100 years. So I think that's really telling that these areas can, under state forest management, retain those values and be protected. I entirely agree with your point. There may well be small areas that need extra protection, particularly as visitor use increases. There's no problems with that, but yeah, the mindset needs to be keep these areas open to as many activities as possible, rather than locking them up and basically throwing away the key, because we know that management doesn't work. And you look at some of the national parks, Parks Victoria has been severely limited. And we were talking before about restrictions in budgets for state game reserves and enforcement and things like that. That's the same across the entire parks estate. So to create new national parks, that's going to put more pressure on that funding, and just keeping people out of it. It doesn't work.
Yeah. And it's clear. It's clear that the government is trying to say to the community through this Great Outdoors Taskforce that they agree with that sentiment.
Yep. Yeah, I think it was a really positive meeting, and I mean the proof's always in the pudding. It's very easy to talk things, and we deal with government bureaucrats on a lot of things. And yes, sometimes what's delivered isn't what's perhaps mooted in the first case, but in this case, all the talk is heading in the right direction. All the objectives that they're talking about are really positive. So I think there's some real opportunities here.
There's a saying that I'm increasingly fond of in dealing with governments, which is show, don't tell.
Yes.
That pretty well brings us to the end of this discussion. I mean, there's heaps more we can talk about with public land, and there's heaps more we will talk about with public land. Like I said, this has been an area of contention for SSAA Victoria since people first came home from World War II, jumped in their FJ Holdens with their Sporterized 303s and went into the bush and started deer hunting, or went out and started chasing ducks. And I'm sure it's going to be an area of contention for our grandchildren as well.
Yeah, it is. But we've got to remember that we're not only the envy of all of Australia. We've got more public land access hunting in Victoria than anywhere in Australia. We're also the envy of much of the world. What we have we need to protect, because otherwise it isn't going to be there for our children and grandchildren.
I think that's a really good, important point, Darryl, and a really good note to end on is that we get worked up about these issues, and so we should, and we should be passionate, we should care about them, but there's certainly nowhere in this country and very few places on this earth that have got it as good for public land access, not just for hunting, for all numbers of active outdoor use. Victoria has it all over just about everywhere else in the world.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right, I think that's a good place to leave what will be our last podcast for 2024. As we joked earlier, we are winding down for the Christmas New Year period. So thank you very much for everyone who tunes into these and listens and watches it and gives us other feedback in the association. It really is appreciated. The support's appreciated. The criticism's appreciated. We just want to get better and do our jobs. So for all of you people, for anyone watching or listening, hope it's a really good Christmas and New Year period. I hope whatever it means to you, that you get that out of it, that you're safe, and that we see you again in 2025.